Today, I'd like to welcome the very first of our speakers in the Harry Butler Lecture Series, Dr Mikael Siversson. Dr Mikael Siversson is a paleontologist with the Earth and Planetary Sciences Department down at the Western Australian Museum. He gained his PhD in geology in 1993 from the Lund University in Sweden. He's regarded by most of his peers as the world's leading authority on Cretaceous lamniform sharks. And during his scientific career, Mikael has described 1 new family, 8 new genera, and 17 new species of Cretaceous and Paleocene sharks and rays. Apart from working on fossil sharks and rays, he has also published on dinosaurs, mammals from the age of dinosaurs, and mosasaurs, which is an extinct group of giant marine lizards. He organises annual field excursions and expeditions to remote parts of Western Australia, and one of his long-term goals is to improve Western Australia's stature in the paleontologist community in regards to its fossil record on dinosaurs, which currently doesn't have a particularly good record. So to tell you more and to welcome him to Geraldton, Dr Mikael Siversson.
Thank you. I can just briefly mention regarding dinosaurs that Western Australia, we've had in total 3 dinosaur bones, and 2 of them are from Geraldton. So although it's still a pathetic record, Geraldton is the mecca of dinosaurs in Western Australia. Yes, welcome to the 2010 International Year of Biodiversity series of talk we're giving here at the museum. The talk I'm going to give today has 3 components. One is obviously looking at the biodiversity, and since we are looking at extinct animals, we're going to look at one particular groups of sharks, and we're going to see how their diversity has changed over 130, 140 million years. The other aspect is to look at this particular group of sharks, the lamniform sharks, and see how they have fought epic battles against various groups of extinct marine reptiles for supremacy in the oceans. Because for a long period of time, these sharks were the apex predators in the oceans. And the third aspect is to look more in detail what we do at the museum in this regard, well, fossil sharks. I'm going to give examples of where we go and what we find. But if we start by very briefly looking at the a jaw of a modern lamniform sharks. Now, what is a lamniform shark? Well, there are 8 or 9 orders of modern sharks, and the lamniform sharks happen to be one of those. And examples of modern lamniform sharks include the great white shark, the grey nurse shark, the megamouth shark. And since sharks, their skeleton is made up of cartilage, which usually does not preserve very well compared to, for example, an extinct marine reptile, which has a skeleton made up of bone. But sharks, they have a lot of teeth, and they continue to produce teeth throughout their life. So any given shark will produce thousands of teeth. And they are shed on a more or less regular basis and incorporated into the sediment and have a high preservation potential. So sharks' teeth are common in sediments. So the most common fossils we do find of sharks are their teeth. In some groups of sharks, the vertebrae are calcified by calcium phosphate, so they tend to preserve quite well as well in some of these sharks. And by the way, this is a long-fin mako shark, which is one of the lamniform sharks. And one character in lamniform sharks that sets them apart from other sharks is they have the so-called lamniform tooth patterns, which means in the upper jaw, the teeth are formed in 2 troughs. And in many of the lamnids, the 3rd tooth is reduced. So that's one of many characters in this group. And when you go out in the field as a paleontologist, you primarily look at the teeth. And when you find, for example, isolated teeth, you try to collect as many as you can, and then you try to reconstruct the dentition. In rare cases, you may find an association of teeth and other remains vertebrae of a shark that actually died on the spot. And this is an example of a, don't pass this on, confident. I've got permission, yes, because that's my name, look. Yes, this is a shark that was found in Kansas. It's a species that also occurs in some deposits in Western Australia, in Kalbarri, for example, in the Duralia range. And this specimen was found as an association of teeth from one single individual. And by using modern lamniform sharks as template, we've tried to reconstruct the dentition here. It's also interesting, this particular specimen, it shows a general trend, and I will get back to that, of tooth reduction. The early lamniform sharks, they had lots of teeth, whereas many of the modern ones have a rather lower number of teeth. The white shark, mako shark, for example, they have around 12 tooth files. And that's one of the main reasons for the reduction is for these to develop larger teeth. If you develop larger teeth, you have to get rid of tooth files. And you can see here the initial stages of tooth reduction. You see this is the first tooth in the lateral pouch, and it's quite reduced, whereas if you had gone back 10 million years, this tooth would be much larger. But if we leave the sharks now for a moment and look at the interaction, we look at the apex predators in the ocean. Let's travel back 150 million years to the Jurassic period, where the giants ruled the earth. And this is a monstrous pliosaur. It was found in Svalbard, which is an island north of Norway, and it hasn't been formally described. It's called the Predator X. But these were the apex predators in the oceans for a long time, the giant pliosaurs and another group of extinct marine reptiles called the ichthyosaurs. And we know from skeletal remains of another type of long-necked plesiosaurs in England that they were often attacked by the pliosaurs. And these pliosaurs were formidable animals. Typically, they would grow to about 10 meters, maybe weighing up to about 5 tons. And has anyone of you seen BBC's series Walking with Dinosaurs? Some of you might have seen that. There is one episode devoted to these pliosaurs, giant pliosaurs. And one interesting thing about that specific episode is that it's portrayed as an absolutely enormous animal, 25 meters long, with a weight of 150 tons. And people in general probably would believe that that's based on a good skeleton, or at least partial skeletons. But it's an interesting story surrounding that particular individual. A number of decades ago in a museum in England, there was a large marine reptile bone, a vertebra, about that size. It was lying on a shelf. And during a time when there was probably not a lot of funding going into the museum, I mean, funding, it goes ups and downs to the museum. Sometimes museums have more money, and sometimes they have less. And presumably during a time where they didn't have any curator of paleontology, at some stage, someone decided that they were going to do something about this giant vertebra they had found. So they were thinking, now what can we do? I know what we do. We paint it blue. So they painted it blue. So now they had this blue, large, precious, giant vertebra of extinct marine reptile. And the next idea they came up with was, we need a doorstop. Let's use it as a doorstop. So they had this absolutely precious giant vertebrae, now painted blue, used as a doorstop. And many decades later, a guy who was working on pliosaurs, he came across this big thing that, at least at times, had been used as a doorstop. And he saw similarities between that vertebra and the neck vertebrae of some of the pliosaurs. The only thing was much, much bigger. And somehow BBC picked up on that, this giant pliosaurs. And his estimate was that it would have been maybe 25 meters long, and they came up with the weight of 150 tons. which was fair enough, based on an actual specimen. But other people started looking at this vertebra, and they concluded that it probably was the tail vertebra, not a neck vertebra, the tail vertebra of a sauropod dinosaur, which is something totally different. So eventually, the 25-meter Leoplerodon is back to 10 meters. Yeah. Instead of 150 tons, it was probably 3, 4, maybe 5 tons. But regardless, they were fearsome predators, and they ruled the oceans. And there were sharks around at this time, but they were quite small, maybe up to 2 or 3 meters. In Australia, our pliosaur was Kronosaurus. It's been found primarily in Queensland. The last field trip up to Kalbarri was in October 2008. We did find a vertebra of Kronosaurus. Kronosaurus grew to about 10 meters and would have weighed again 3, 4, maybe 5 tons. And for a long time, it was regarded as, and still is by the people working on pliosaurs, I have no doubt, as the apex predators in the inland sea that covered Australia. During this time, the sea level is much higher. Kronosaurus is from the early part of the Cretaceous period, 110, 120 million years ago. The other type of large reptile that was also basically among the apex predators were the ichthyosaurs. And the common ichthyosaurs we had in Australia was Planetary, and we have a set of vertebrae on display in the gallery here. We found quite a few remains of these in Western Australia, in Kalbarri and in the Duralia range. And some of the early ichthyosaurs, they were absolutely enormous. There's one Kronosaurus from the later part of the Triassic that could grow to about 20 meters. But it seems that it switched to a plankton diet because the adults, you can see a reduction in teeth as they reached adulthood. And this is an image of the skeleton of an ichthyosaurus. You can see I have lots of vertebrae, and they are the most common fossils that we do find. There's one site in Kalbarri. Every time we go there, we will find the bones of ichthyosaurs, 110, 120 million years old. And here we are, one of our volunteers. He's very good at finding fossils, and he's holding a vertebra of an ichthyosaur found near Kalbarri. The ichthyosaurs, however, once you get into the Cenomanian period, which is one period within the Cretaceous, the Cretaceous is between 140, 145 million years ago to 65 million years ago. And the Cenomanian is basically right in the middle. And this is a section up near Kalbarri, and the sediment we see here, all of this was laid down in the ocean on the shelf. See, the sediment here is a green sand, and then here you get a laminations preserved at this boundary. And when you have laminations formed in its marine sediment, that indicates that there is very low levels of oxygen. Because normally, if you have a well-oxygenated bottom condition, you have a lot of worms and other animals digging in the sediment and basically destroying any primary lamination formed by the sediment as it's deposited. And it turns out that at this boundary between the Cenomanian period and the Turonian period, anywhere you look worldwide, you get the same story. You get laminations, black shales are laid down. And the prevailing theory is that at this time we had a very rapid and large global sea level rise. So the water are flooding the oceans, and there's a lot of organic material being flushed out from land. And as this organic material is oxidized in the oceans, it consumes all the oxygens. So basically, anywhere you look in the world at this particular interval, where the sediment was laid down below 140 meters, there was no oxygen. So there was a major extinction event at this level. And the ichthyosaurs, they went extinct. But they had already been in decline for maybe 5 or 10 million years. And why was that, one could ask? The pliosaurs, the really large pliosaurs, they died out a few million years later. That was a bit strange, one would think. So when I first came over here in 1994, I started looking at shark's teeth. That was my speciality. So I went out into some of the sites in the Duralia range and in Calvaria, and I found all these beautiful shark's teeth. This is one perfectly preserved from the Duralia range, from the Cenomanian period, would be about 95 million years old. And when you look at the teeth of the shark, use the modern ones as a template, you can get a rough idea about the length of the shark, or so we thought. A very rough estimate. If you look at the largest teeth in the jaw, if they are 3 centimeters, that would indicate a shark roughly 3 meters, very roughly, in that group of sharks. And the largest ones I found were about 3.5 centimeters, indicating we had sharks in that area about 3.5 meters long. And there were no other large apex predators around in this particular area, so it was quite unusual to have an apex predator that small. In the modern, today, for example, the true apex predator would be the orca, I would say, or the sperm whale is very large, but it's very specialized also in its feeding habits. One day in 1996, when I was walking along the outcrops in the Duralia range, that was just a few days before there was a tropical cyclone, Cyclone Olivia, I believe, struck that area, or came very close. I was walking along the outcrops with my wife, and we spotted all these shark's teeth lying on the ground. And that was a particular species. I had found the odd isolated tooth elsewhere, and I had tried to figure out where it belonged within the lamniform sharks. And finding an association of teeth and vertebrae of a shark is very rare. Usually only find isolated teeth. So we started excavating the site, and we find all these beautifully preserved teeth. And these are teeth from the lower jaw. I'm not sure if you are good at looking at stereoscopic images, but if you can sort of cross your eyes, this is a stereo image. So you can get a 3-dimensional picture of this one as well, and these as well. So these are teeth from the lower jaw. These are from the lower jaw, from the other side. And in general, they get smaller towards the corner of the mouth with a more distally curved cusp. These are upper jaw teeth. And this turned out to be a undescribed shark. And it was found on the Cardabaya station, so I named it Cardabiodon, which means the tooth from Cardabaya. It also established a new family, the Cardabiodontidae, because of the quite unique dental formula. Obviously, that's to some extent open to interpretation, because once you get all these teeth, you then have to figure out how they were positioned in the jaw. So you try, again, you look at the modern sharks using that as a template, and you try to figure out the dentition. The interesting bit, though, was that apart from that was very interesting finding all the teeth, but we found more things, and that just blew my mind, because we found these big whopping vertebrae. Now, a vertebral centre in a shark gives a better indication about the size of the sharks. If you look at the modern lamnid sharks, the mako sharks and the porbeagle sharks, for example, there's a strong correlation between the maximum vertebral diameter and the total length of the shark. And these were huge, much bigger than I would expect of a shark that had teeth up to about 3.5 centimeters. They were, in fact, of the same size as those of a white shark, between 5.5 and 6 meters. And I also found initially, when I tried to reconstruct the dentition, that I there seems to be a lot more tooth files than in the modern ones. And I thought, well, that made sense when I found all these big vertebrae. And it turns out that as we found more undescribed species, that back in the middle part of the Cretaceous, about 95 million years ago, many of these early lamniform sharks, they had not yet started the process of tooth reduction. So they had a lot more tooth files. So we had underestimated their size. So it turns out that this particular shark, Cardabidon, probably could grow to about 8 meters. And if it was built like a white shark, at that length it would weigh 3 or 4 tons, which is basically puts it right up at the size of the pliosaurs. So it seems that and already the earliest really large sharks we find, again, are from Australia. So Australia is very important when it comes to the study of these early giant lamniform sharks, the single most important place in the world, in fact. And we have remains from undescribed species of this genus Cardabidon from Queensland that indicates that already by 110 million years ago we had sharks about 6, 7, 8 meters. So it seems that they, for the first time, posed a serious threat to the reptiles as apex predators and eventually won that battle. So the last pliosaurs, they died out around 92 million years, roughly, and now the lamniform sharks, they rule the oceans. They were the apex predators. And one interesting thing with this Cardabidon is a project that I recently started with some Canadian people, because they found remains of this Cardabidon shark in Canada as well. So what we did is we took a vertebra from the Cardabidon shark, and we sectioned it, and we looked at these growth bands. If you look at modern lamniform sharks, they deposit a darker band on what is believed to be an annular basis. So based on that, it seems that the Cardabidon shark was around 12 years old at the time it died. And it was probably not an adult, because in modern sharks, as sharks reach maturity, the growth tends to slow down. And you can only possibly see a slowdown at the very last. Maybe it was sick. So it was, and it also gives an indication about the size when he was born. You gave an indication of the diameter of the vertebra. And by using modern lamnid as a template, these were probably born at a large size, around 2 meters, which is similar to the white shark, relatively speaking, since this was a larger shark, could probably grow to about 8 meters. This is another individual of Cardabidon. And you can see here a marked crowding of the growth rings after about 5, indicating that this one was a more mature shark. Maybe the first one was a female. Female lamniform sharks, they tend to mature at a later age. Maybe this was a male, or there could be just variation within that species. And here we can see the growth curves of these sharks plotted against. These are some of the other extinct sharks, Crocus. And you can see it's increasing in size quite rapidly. I mentioned that this particular species has been found in other places as well. Canada. This is a beautifully preserved tooth from the lower jaw, found in the chalk of England. So it was a widespread shark, but it occurs mainly in the higher paleolatitudes. I mean, the latitudes that applied back then, because the continent, as you may know, they shift around continuously. So we had a situation where the lamniform sharks, they ruled the oceans. They were the apex predators. This is western Kansas, and look at this beautiful image. No vegetation here. Beautiful. As a paleontologist, you don't want the vegetation to cover your outcrops. You want what they call a badland area with no plants. Have all these beautiful outcrops. And this is a very well-known formation called the Niobrara chalk, and it's renowned for its perfectly preserved vertebrate fossils. This was much of the North America, the western part of North America, was covered by an inland sea about 100 to 65 million years ago. And there was something on the rise. The reptiles, the marine reptiles, had briefly given up the struggle for supremacy when the ichthyosaurs died out about 92, 93 million years ago, and the pliosaurs, the really large pliosaurs, died out soon afterwards. But something was on the rise. And look at this. This is a beautifully preserved skull of a new breed of marine reptiles, the mosasaurs. And this is measures, I think that's 1 meter, so it's a really large mosasaur. The first mosasaurs that evolved were quite small, 2-3 meters. And they are particularly common in this Niobrara chalk. So what was the shark's response to this new breed of ferocious marine reptiles? Well, they responded in a grand style. Look at that image. This image is based on an actual fossil found in the Niobrara chalk. It is a Cretoxurina shark, which at that time could grow to a size of up to about 7 meters. It grabbed hold of a mosasaur. And you can see the mosasaurs, they are probably most closely related to the monitor lizards. But some researchers believe they're more closely related to the snakes. But they were equipped with a large head. They had an extra hinge here, so they could really open up their gape tremendously. The bones in the skull were loosely attached by ligaments, a bit like a snake, so they could really expand their mouth. That ability was reduced later on, as the skull grew more solid. So the later forms of mosasaur, they had a more solid construction of the skull. This is a beautifully preserved skull of the Cretoxurina shark, partly mummified, found in Kansas. So you can see it's the head lying upside down. This is the outline of the lower jaw. This is the upper jaw. You can see all these fearsome teeth. And this is the fossil that illustration is actually based on. It's the midsection of the back of a 6-meter-long mosasaur. It's been attacked by a Cretoxurina shark that basically took a big bite. It basically severed the mosasaur into 2 pieces. Well, it kept the third pieces in its mouth and swallowed it. So they were absolutely brutal, these sharks. You can see there's a tooth, a broken tooth of Cretoxurina still stuck in the vertebra of the mosasaur. A few days, a few weeks later, these remains were regurgitated, and the mosasaurs the sharks often did that, whereas reptiles, they have better ability to actually dissolve the bones. But the sharks, you see, as you walk the outcrops there in Kansas, every now and then you come across a little pile of etched mosasaur bones, they've then been regurgitated by these sharks. There's another illustration showing the probable outline of the mouth with that section of the jawbone. Here are other examples from the Niobrara chalk. Various bones of mosasaurs. They all show signs of being corroded by the gastric fluids of the sharks and then regurgitated. So it was not an easy environment for these reptiles to gain any dominance over the shark. So what do, the reptiles, in order to counter this very obvious threat from these giant Cretoxurina sharks? Well, we've actually been looking at growth rates in the largest of the Mosasaur, Talosaurus. And it shows that they changed tactics. They accelerated the growth rate as juveniles. So they tried to reach maturity faster, so to outgrow the sharks. And eventually, they won that battle. And Cretoxyrhina went extinct 80 million years ago. And by the time it went extinct, the largest Talosaur was absolutely enormous, 13 meters long. You can see here a comparison of the skeleton of Talosaurus with that of a T-Rex. So the mosasaurs now rule the oceans, not the sharks. And they did so for the remaining 15 million years of the Cretaceous period, until a meteorite struck the Earth and wiped out the dinosaurs. They wiped out the Tylosaurs, the other mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, pterosaurs, which were the extinct marine reptiles. About half of all shark species went extinct. But during these 15 million years of time, you don't find any sharks basically larger than 3, maybe 4 meters. So they were kept in check by the mosasaurs. But once the mosasaurs went extinct, so we have these, the largest lamniform sharks being around 3 or 4 meters, and then we have the extinction, and then they just go sky high. They just explode in size, clearly showing that they were unable to compete for that niche with the mosasaurs, because once the mosasaurs were gone, they immediately took over that niche. Here's just to show you that we actually do have some remains of these mosasaurs. This is a tail vertebra from a Tylosaurian mosasaur found in the Duralia range, and it's 66, maybe 67 million years ago. The extinction of all the dinosaurs and other animal life took place about 65 million years ago. So you have basically 2 or 3 lineages of lamniform sharks that quickly move into that niche as apex predator. And this was one of them, Palaeocarcharodon. So Palaeocarcharodon presumably had a long evolutionary history as a shark with fairly narrow teeth, probably specializing on fish. Once the mosasaurs is gone, it starts developing serrations. You can see a gradual acquisition of serrations. That process took about 2 million years. And once it evolved serrations, it was better adapted to attack larger prey, because you can cut out pieces of flesh from a larger prey. But as you switch to a larger prey, it also makes you more vulnerable to extinction. And sure enough, about 2 million years after it had evolved these beautiful serrations, it went extinct. Another lineage of lamniform shark, the Otodus carcharocles lineage, evolved serrations during the Eocene period, roughly 50, 55 million years ago. And again, this is from a sequence in Kazakhstan, where we have a nice continuous record over this period. And you can see here how they gradually evolve serrations. Around that time, Eocene, you get the first whales develop. And that is a particular important event in the history of these giant lamniform sharks, because that provides these sharks with a food source. I mean, nature will only allow you to grow gigantic if there is a suitable food source that goes along with it. So this lamniform shark, Carcharocles, now had a perfect food source that was increasing in size, so it started to increase in size. And it grew, and it grew, and it eventually produced the absolutely colossal Carcharocles megalodon. This is the largest predator, excluding filter feeders, the largest predator this planet has ever seen. And the latest estimates is that they could grow, the largest ones could grow to 18 to 19 meters and weigh up to 50 metric tons. And by comparison, white sharks An exceptionally large female white shark may reach possibly two tons if it's really well fed. I think the largest reliably measured one was just 6 meters. There are numerous reports of much bigger ones, but once you scrutinize the data, they all fall apart. So 6 meters is about the maximum length for the white shark. So they were absolutely enormous. And they died out as recently as 2 million years ago, 2.5 million years ago. And they fed on baleen whales, on giant baleen whales. So our ancestors, our hominid ancestors, probably witnessed these absolutely epic battle when you have these poor baleen whales being attacked by these sharks. And Megalodon is unique in that it has very thick teeth as well. A white shark has quite broad teeth, but they are quite flat. A white shark, when it attacks something bony like a marine mammal, it often goes for the softer parts. Not Megalodon. It had a bone-crushing dentition. It would crush the rib cages. It would bite through the huge vertebrae of these baleen whales. I've seen baleen whales about this big. Looks like someone's gone through them with a chainsaw. So they were absolutely spectacular. But when you are 18, 19 meters and weigh 50 tons, you are putting yourself in a precarious situation because you depend on availability of baleen whales. And there was a very important change in environment taking place about 2 million years ago when we head into the first ice age. And what happens, as far as from the shark perspective, was that their food source disappeared because every summer the baleen whales would migrate to higher latitudes to feed on crustaceans in these cold waters. And Crocus couldn't follow. It could not adapt quick enough, so it was basically left without a food source for a large part of the year, at least several months. So they disappear, they go extinct. And that's our best shot at explaining why they went extinct. And so basically, as a lamniform shark, once you develop serrations and start developing big teeth, you are setting yourself up for extinction. This is a Crocus megalodon tooth. It's the remain from the largest known predator from Western Australia. Based on its size and comparing it to whole dentitions that we have found of Crocus megalodon, it probably grew to about 13, 14 meters, give or take a meter or so, and a weight of roughly 20 tons. And that's about 10 times as heavy as the largest white shark. And we're going to go back to this site in Cape Range in probably August, of course after having secured all the necessary permits from DEC. And but I'm sure we will get that, surely. Yes. I'm going to prepare this out of the rock, but it's a nice display showing how it was actually found. And we have a couple of more of these megalodon teeth from Cape Range in rocks from the Miocene period. Then returning to the white shark itself. The white shark has a different origin. For a long time, people thought that Megalodon and white shark were closely related. There's a few scientists that still believe so, but the majority of us, we see the white shark evolving from the mako sharks. And this is an early white shark, about 79 million years old. You can see no serrations. And then about 6 million years ago, they start developing weak serrations, and a bit stronger here, 4.5 million years. This one is about 2 million years, and they had fully developed serrations like the modern one. So what does that mean for the white shark's prospects of survival? Well, based on its relatives, it might have set itself up for extinction. Curiously, it hasn't really increased in size, which is the normal pattern. Once they evolve serration, they tend also to increase in size. But that could be possibly due to the ice age. So once we get out of the ice age, they might start increasing in size. But the odds are that the white shark eventually will go extinct, even without human intervention, because that certainly has been the pattern in the past. And here's a comparison of we have the early white shark, and here transitional form, here the modern white shark, and compared to Megalodon. You can see one difference here is that the lamniform sharks, they have a reduced third upper anterior tooth, which means they can put more power, basically, onto the remaining cusps, instead of having to distribute the power of the jaws, the front teeth on 3 points, and now it's just 2 points. Whereas Megalodon has such an immense bone-crushing dentitions, and that really didn't need that adaptation. And just finally going back to looking at the biodiversity, which is basically what this talk is partly about. This is images taken from Compagnos sharks of the world. And it shows a comparison between lamniform sharks and whaler sharks, which are in the order Carchariniformes. If we look at the lamniform sharks, they reached their peak in diversity about 100 million years ago, when we have about very roughly 100 species. And ever since the middle part of the Cretaceous, they have lost ground. Their diversity is slowly but steadily going down, so today we have about 15 species. And the trend is that they will go extinct. And if we look at the lamniform sharks that has gone through about 130, 140 million years of evolution, they are all extremes. Look at the thresher sharks. Hey, look at me. I developed a humongous tail. I'm the king of tails. Now, if the thresher shark's environment suddenly collapsed, it couldn't go up in river and started feeding in rivers with that big whopping tail. The same with the megamouth shark, really highly specialized filter feeder. Same with the basking shark and the white shark. Super predator needs an abundance of certainly of large prey as adults. Whereas the whaler sharks, which evolved about 50 million years ago, they look all the same. If you put whaler sharks about 20 meters away, it would be very hard even for an expert to tell them apart. They are very similar. And they are radiating rapidly and increasing in diversity at the expense of the lamniform sharks. If you look at a assemblage of sharks 30, 40 million years ago, there might be half lamniform sharks in the shallow water, half would be whaler sharks, but today there will be predominantly whaler sharks. And there's a black-tip shark, bull shark, bronze whaler, silver-tip shark. So they are highly successful, the lamniform sharks, whereas the lamnids, or the whaler sharks, whereas the lamniform sharks, if you imagine a tree branching off and producing all these branches with various extreme form, but most of the branches now gone through extinction, you have these few specialists remaining. So that's why it's especially important to focus on the conservation of these lamniform sharks, including the white sharks, because they are threatened, their survival is threatened even without human intervention. And I think that basically concludes my talk. I thank you for listening to this talk, and I hope you learned something about these lamniform sharks. Thank you.